The director tapped the microphone twice, smiled at the crowded hall, and said, "None of this would exist without the vision of one man." I was sitting in the third row with a folder on my knees. A folder full of attendance sheets and lesson plans and 3 years of my own handwriting. And I felt my stomach drop before she even said his name. Please welcome the founder of our after-school tutoring program, Marcus Bell. The applause came warm and easy. My brother stood up 2 rows ahead of me, buttoned his blazer, and walked to the podium like a man collecting something he had always been owed. I clapped too. I clapped because everyone was clapping, and because my hands did not know what else to do. And because the folder on my knees suddenly weighed as much as a stone. You should know that I built that program. Not helped with it, not supported it. Built it. From an empty room and a borrowed folding table 3 winters ago. When I was 32 and quietly falling apart after losing my teaching job to budget cuts at the elementary school across town. My name is Elena Bell, and for most of my life, I have been the one who does the work while someone louder stands in the light. I used to think that was just my temperament, that I was shy, that I preferred the background. It took me a long time, and one very public night, to understand that some people are not shy. Some people are simply never given the microphone and then blamed for being quiet. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is the proof, even if no one in that hall knew it. 3 years ago, the community center on Reyes Street had a room nobody used. A long room with a leaking radiator and green paint peeling off the walls like old skin. I asked the director, a kind, overworked woman named Mrs. Okafor, if I could use it 2 afternoons a week for children who were failing reading and math. She looked at me the way people look at someone offering to shovel their driveway for free, half grateful, half suspicious. "We can't pay you," she said. I told her I didn't need to be paid. I needed something to do with my hands and my hope. I should tell you what those first weeks actually looked like, because the whole story lives in the details nobody photographed. I would arrive at the center at 2 o'clock, before the children, to run a space heater in front of the broken radiator so the room would be warm enough that small fingers could hold a pencil. I would wipe down the long table, which someone had used the night before for a card game. And I would set out the pencils in a straight row, because Aaliyah, I quickly learned, calmed down when things were orderly. I brought a thermos of tea and a tin of the cheap butter cookies, the ones in the blue tin. And I put 4 on a napkin at the end of the table, 1 reward each. Because a hungry child cannot learn, and a child who is never rewarded stops trying. Nobody told me to do any of this. I simply paid attention. And attention, it turns out, is most of teaching. The first day, 4 children came. 4. A boy named Diego, who read like every word was a wall he had to climb. A girl named Aaliyah, who hid her worksheet under her arm so I couldn't see how little she'd written. Twins, Sam and Rosa, who finished each other's wrong answers. I remember the light that afternoon, thin and gray through the tall windows, and the smell of the radiator, hot dust and metal. I remember thinking that if I could get even one of them to smile at a book, the whole broken year might mean something. I laid out 4 pencils. I wrote my name on the board, and I began. For the first 2 months, it was just me. I bought the flashcards with my own money. I photocopied worksheets at the library because the center's machine was broken. I learned each child's fears the way you learn a song, slowly, by repetition. Diego was ashamed, not slow. Aaliyah was fast, but terrified of being wrong. The twins needed to be separated to think. I kept a notebook, a plain blue one, where I wrote down what worked and what didn't, 1 page per child, dated in the corner. I still have that notebook. It never occurred to me then that a plain blue notebook full of a woman's small handwriting could one day be a kind of evidence. I just wanted to remember. I marked their progress in ways no grant report ever captured. The first time Diego read a whole page out loud without stopping, I wrote the date in the corner of the blue notebook and drew a small star, because he had earned a star and no one had ever given him one. The first time Aaliyah raised her hand to answer instead of hiding, I had to pretend to drop something so I could bend down and hide how my eyes had filled. These are the moments a program is actually made of, and not one of them fits on a spreadsheet. Marcus's 12-page proposal had a graph of reading levels rising over time. It was accurate. It was also a lie, because a rising line on a graph tells you nothing about the boy who used to hide under his hood. And everything a graph leaves out was the part I had actually done. The program grew the way good, unglamorous things grow, by word of mouth from tired parents. 4 children became 9. 9 became 16. By the end of the first year, I had a waiting list and 2 volunteer high schoolers I'd recruited myself. I named it, too. I called it Open Door, because the whole point was that no child would be turned away for being behind. I painted a little sign myself, a door with light coming through the crack, and taped it above the peeling green wall. Mrs. Okafor started introducing me to visitors as our Elena, who works miracles in that room. I was so happy back then to be called our Elena. I didn't know how quickly a person can go from being someone's miracle to being someone's oversight. My brother Marcus entered the story in the 2nd year, and he entered the way weather enters, gradually and then all at once. Marcus is 3 years older than me, tall, easy, the kind of man who remembers everyone's name and makes them feel briefly important. He'd lost a job in sales and was, as our mother put it, between opportunities. He came to the center one afternoon to drop off a check from our family for the holiday party, and he stayed 40 minutes, charming the parents in the hallway. On the drive home, he said, "You know, Alina, you're terrible at the business side. You should let me handle the paperwork, grants, letters, that kind of thing. Free up your time for the actual teaching." I was so grateful. I thought my brother had finally seen me. There is a small memory from that same afternoon I have turned over many times since. When Marcus dropped off the family's check, he stood in the doorway of my long room and looked around at the peeling green paint and the mismatched chairs and the space heater, and he said, "God, Alina, how do you stand it in here? It's depressing." He didn't mean it cruelly. He genuinely could not see what I saw. Where I saw Diego finally sounding out the word bridge, Marcus saw a shabby room. Where I saw 3 years of patient love, Marcus saw an underfunded asset that a smarter person could package and sell to the city. I understand now that we were never looking at the same thing. He was looking at the frame. I was looking at the children inside it. That difference is the whole story, if you want it in one sentence. That is the first clue I want you to hold on to, because I missed it completely at the time. It was not an offer of help. It was an offer to stand between me and every official piece of paper that had my name on it. Within a month, Marcus had a key to the office. Within 2, he was CC'd on Mrs. Okafor's emails. I remember the small, strange feeling the first time an email about my own program arrived in my inbox, with my brother already copied at the top. as though he were the parent and I were the child who needed supervising. I told myself it was efficient. I told myself family helps family. I have said a lot of gentle things to myself over the years to keep from seeing what was in front of me. I remember one particular evening from that second year that I should have read as a warning. Marcus came by the center at closing time to pick up some forms, and one of the parents, Rosa and Sam's father, shook his hand warmly and said, "Thank you for what you do for my kids." I was standing right there. Codon, the actual teacher of his actual children, and Marcus said, "It's my pleasure. We're really proud of the program." And the father nodded at Marcus, and then nodded politely at me, the way you nod at a coat rack, and left. Marcus didn't correct him. He didn't even seem to notice there was anything to correct. On the drive home, he hummed along to the radio, completely at ease. And I sat in the passenger seat, feeling something curdle that I did not yet have a name for. I know its name now. It was the feeling of being slowly turned into a rumor about myself. To understand why I let it happen, you have to sit at one of our Sunday dinners. In our family, there were roles, assigned early and never revised. Marcus was the star, the one whose stories made our father laugh, the one whose small successes were announced like headlines. I was the reliable one, the one who cleared the plates, the one whose report cards were "nice, honey," and set aside. Our father, who died 4 years ago, had a way of turning to Marcus at the head of the table and saying, "This boy is going places." He never said where I was going. I don't think he thought I was going anywhere. And when a person is taught for 30 years that her work is furniture, she learns to be surprised, almost embarrassed, when anyone notices it at all. So when Marcus began answering the center's emails as program lead, I noticed, and I said nothing. When he introduced himself to a visiting councilwoman as the coordinator of Open Door, I stood 2 feet away, still holding a stack of Diego's spelling tests, and I smiled like a fool. I told myself the title was just for the meeting, just to sound official. That titles were the kind of thing men like Marcus needed, and men like Marcus could keep, as long as I got to keep the children. It is a strange bargain to hand away your name in exchange for permission to keep doing your own work. But I had made that bargain my whole life, and I did not yet know it could cost me everything at once. The second clue arrived in the spring of the second year, folded inside good news. A City Arts and Education Foundation announced a grant, $8,000, for community learning programs. I wrote the application myself over 3 long nights at my kitchen table, describing Open Door, our methods, our results, the reading levels that had climbed a full grade in a single year. I wrote about Diego, who had gone from hiding under his hood to reading aloud to the younger children. I gave the application to Marcus to submit through the office because he handled the paperwork. A month later, we got the grant. Mrs. Okafor hugged me in the hallway, and on the foundation's website, under the list of funded programs, the contact name read, in clean official letters, Marcus Bell. I stared at that name on my phone screen in the parking lot for a long time. I remember the exact cold of the metal door handle under my other hand. I told myself it was a clerical thing, that Marcus had used his own name because his email was the one on file, that it didn't matter who was listed, as long as the money reached the children. I even felt guilty for the flash of hurt, as though wanting my own name on my own work were a kind of vanity. When I mentioned it to Marcus, lightly, in the car, he laughed and said, "Come on, Elena. Does it really matter whose name is on some website? We're a team. You do the teaching, I do the front-facing stuff. That's how organizations work. We're a team. I held on to those 2 words like a life raft for another 6 months. Here is what a slow betrayal feels like from the inside, in case you have never lived one. It does not feel like being robbed. It feels like being edited. One small correction at a time, each one reasonable on its own, each one easy to forgive. Until you look up one day and find that the story of your own life has been rewritten around you, and you are no longer the subject of the sentence. My afternoon stayed the same. I still unlocked the long room, still fixed the radiator with a wad of folded cardboard, still learned each new child's particular fear. But the emails, the meetings, the website, the grant reports, the growing pile of official paper, all of it now said Marcus. And official paper, I was about to learn, is what the world calls the truth. The midpoint of this story, the moment the ground shifted under me, came on an ordinary Tuesday in the 3rd year. I had stayed late to organize the book donations, and I went into the office to find a stapler. Marcus's laptop was open on the desk, and on the screen was a document I had never seen. It was a proposal to the city, 12 pages, professionally formatted, titled Open Door Tutoring, a Model for Expansion. Presented by founder and director, Marcus Bell. I sat down slowly in the desk chair. I scrolled. There were photographs of my students, my lesson structure described in my own words, lifted from my grant application. My 3 years of results laid out in a graph. And on page 10, a line that stopped my breath. A request for the city to fund a full-time paid director position, salary listed, to be filled by Marcus Bell. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it was not, at first, anger. It was a terrible, disorienting grief, the kind you feel when something you loved turns out to have never been safe. My brother had not borrowed my program. He had adopted it, renamed himself its father, and gone to the city to be paid a salary for the years of unpaid love I had poured into that leaking green room. And the worst part, the part that made me press my hand flat against my mouth in that empty office, was how good the document was, how complete, how thoroughly it erased me. There was not one sentence in 12 pages that so much as mentioned an Elena. I had been deleted from my own life by a man who called me sis and meant it. I did not confront him that night. I want to explain why, because I think some of you will be shouting at me across your screens, and I understand. I went home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway with the engine off, and I let myself finally see the whole shape of it. All the way back to a folding table and 4 frightened children. And what I understood was this. If I stormed into that office the next morning waving my blue notebook, it would be my word against his paperwork. My handwriting against his official documents. My quiet 3 years against his loud 12 pages. In every version of that fight, I could already hear our mother's voice saying, "Elena, why do you always have to make things difficult? Can't you just be happy the children are helped?" I had lost that fight before, at every dinner table of my childhood. I did not want to lose it again with the truth on my side. So I did something that felt, at the time, like giving up. I decided to say nothing, and to keep teaching, and to let whatever was going to happen, happen. It was not a strategy. I was not clever. I was tired and heartbroken, and I did not believe, deep down, that the world would ever choose a quiet woman's word over a confident man's documents. I went back to my long room the next afternoon, and I taught a lesson on writing friendly letters, because it was on the curriculum. And because with children, you cannot afford to fall apart, they watch your face too closely. I told them to write a letter to someone who had helped them learn something. I told them to be specific, to use real details, to say thank you in their own words. It was, I promise you, only a grammar lesson. I had no idea what I was doing. Before I read them, I want you to picture that lesson, because it was the last ordinary afternoon before everything turned. It was raining, a steady gray rain against the tall windows, and the radiator was losing its argument with the cold, so the children kept their coats on. I wrote 3 phrases on the board. Dear, and thank you for, and because you, and I told them a letter is just a way of making a person feel how much they matter to you, and that the secret is to be specific. Don't write, thank you for teaching me, I said. Write the exact thing. What did you learn? What did it feel like? Diego asked, can we write to anybody? And I said, anybody who helped you learn something real. He looked at me for a second, with an expression I didn't understand at the time. And then he bent over his paper and began to write, like the words had been waiting in him for years. I remember walking around the table while they wrote, the way I always did, leaning down to whisper spelling corrections. I remember the smell of wet coats and pencil shavings. I remember thinking, with the small ache I carried everywhere that season, that this would probably be one of the last lessons I taught in a program that would soon officially belong to my brother. I did not cry in front of them. You learn, teaching children, to save your face. I told them to fold their letters, and I collected them in a neat stack, and I thought I was collecting a grammar exercise. I have taught 1,000 lessons in that room. That is the only one that changed my life. And I did not even know it was happening. The children took to it the way they rarely take to writing. Diego, who 3 years earlier could not read a menu, filled 2 whole pages. Aaliyah drew a little border of stars around hers. The twins argued about spelling and then wrote nearly identical letters anyway. I collected them at the end of the hour to check the grammar. And that night at my kitchen table, I read them. And I cried in a way I had not let myself cry in months. Because the children had not written to Marcus. They had not written to the center or the city or the grant. Nearly every single one of them had written to me, Dear Miss Elena, you are the reason I can read now. Dear Miss Elena, you never made me feel dumb. Dear Teacher Elena, my mom says you are the best teacher in the whole city, and I think so too. I sat with those letters for a long time. I understood, holding them, that I finally had something Marcus's 12 professional pages could never contain and could never fake. He had the paperwork of the program. I had its heart, written in pencil, in the crooked, honest print of children who had no reason to lie and no idea there was anything to lie about. But even then, I did not plan to use them. I want you to believe that. I put them in a folder, the same folder I would later carry into that hall, and I told myself I was keeping them because they were precious, which was true. I did not know they were also the exact shape of the truth that everyone in my family had spent 30 years refusing to see. The anniversary event was Mrs. Okafor's idea, a celebration of the center's 20 years. With the tutoring program as the shining example, the board wanted to show off to the city and the local press. Invitations went out. My mother called me delighted to say that Marcus was going to be honored, that a councilman was coming, that there might be a plaque. You'll be there, won't you, Elena? She said, to support your brother? I closed my eyes in my kitchen. To support your brother. 35 years old? and still the supporting role in the movie of my own work. I said yes. I said I would be there. I did not tell her I would be bringing a folder. I almost didn't bring it. On the night of the event, I stood in my bedroom for 10 minutes holding the folder, arguing with myself. Bringing it felt like an ambush, and I am not, by nature, an ambusher. But my student Diego had asked me that week in his shy way, "Miss Elena, are you coming to the party? We made something." I hadn't understood what he meant. I understood only that the children were coming, that their families were coming, and that if the night was going to be about open door, then the door should at least be honest about who had opened it. I put the folder in my bag. I did not have a plan. I had a folder and a feeling, and sometimes that is all justice needs to find its way into a room. I arrived early, the way I always do, and I stood at the back of the hall for a moment before anyone noticed me, watching the room fill. I saw the poster board of photographs propped on an easel near the podium, and I walked over to look at it, and my throat tightened, because every single image on it was mine, was ours, was the long green room and the children I knew by heart. There was a photo of Diego reading to the younger kids that I had taken myself on my own phone the previous spring. Someone had printed it, enlarged it, and mounted it under a header that read, "Marcus Bell's Vision in Action." I stood there in my good cardigan, holding my bag with the folder in it, and I felt the last of my hesitation quietly leave me. Not anger. Something steadier than anger. I thought, whatever happens tonight, I am not going to clap for this. Not this time. The hall was decorated with paper streamers and a long table of cookies and a banner that read, 20 years of community. I found a seat in the third row. Marcus was near the front in a new blazer, laughing with the councilman, gesturing at a poster board of photographs. My photographs, my students, my long green room. My mother sat beside him, glowing, one hand on his sleeve. My students were clustered along the side wall with their parents, small and scrubbed, and excited, and Diego caught my eye and waved with his whole arm, the way children do, and I felt for one warm second that whatever happened, those 3 years had been real, and no document could unmake them. Then the speeches began. A board member spoke about the center's history. Mrs. Okafor spoke, and to her credit, she did say once, "and our wonderful teachers." And I clung to that plural like a splinter of light. And then the director tapped the microphone twice and said the words this whole story opened with. None of this would exist without the vision of one man. She talked about Marcus's leadership, his tireless coordination, his founding vision for Open Door. She used the word founder 3 times. Each time, it landed on me like a small, clean cut. My brother stood, buttoned his blazer, and walked to the podium to accept a framed certificate and the polite, easy applause of a room that had no reason to doubt a confident man in a good jacket. Marcus was, I will admit, an excellent speaker. He thanked the board, he thanked the city. He said, "When I started this program 3 years ago, I had a simple dream that no child in this neighborhood would be left behind." 3 years ago. I had been unlocking that room 3 years ago, while Marcus was still selling insurance in another county. He talked about the countless afternoons I've spent with these kids. He had, in truth, spent perhaps a dozen afternoons in that room, most of them on his phone in the doorway. He said, "My program and my students and my methods," and with every "my," a little more of me left the room. And I sat there, and I let it because I did not know how. To stand up in a crowd and say, "That is mine," without sounding like the small, jealous woman my family had always half suspected I was. And then, into the applause after Marcus finished, a small voice cut clean across the hall. Diego had raised his hand. Not the way you raise your hand at a party, but the way you raise it in a classroom. Straight up, patient, waiting to be called on. Because that is what I had taught him to do. The director, flustered, still smiling, said, "Yes, young man, did you have a question?" And Diego, 9 years old, in a shirt his mother had ironed, said in his careful classroom voice, "Excuse me, who is Marcus? Our teacher is Ms. Elena." The room did a thing rooms rarely do. It went completely, instantly quiet. Not awkward quiet. Listening quiet. The quiet of 100 adults suddenly paying attention. Mrs. Okafor's smile froze. Marcus, at the podium, gave a small laugh and said something about how the children knew all the volunteers by their first names. But then Aaliyah stepped forward from the wall, holding a piece of paper, and she said, "We wrote letters in class. Miss Elena said to write to someone who helped us learn, and Diego said we wanted to read them at the party. That's what we made." And I realized with a rush that was half terror and half something like the first warm water of a thaw, that this was the something Diego had been trying to tell me about all week. The children had not come to be props in Marcus's ceremony. They had come to thank their teacher, out loud, and they had brought the proof in their own small hands. Mrs. Okafor, who is a good woman caught in a bad moment, made a decision I will always be grateful for. She said gently into the microphone, "Well, I think we should hear from our students. Come on up, sweetheart." And Aaliyah walked to the podium, and Marcus had to step aside, and the councilman leaned forward, and my mother's hand slid off my brother's sleeve. Aaliyah unfolded her paper, and in the piping, deliberate voice of a child reading her own best handwriting, she read, "Dear Miss Elena, before you, I thought I was stupid. You told me I was just scared, and scared is not the same as stupid. Now I read to my little brother every night. Thank you for never giving up on me. Love, Aaliyah." She looked up. She looked, not at Marcus, but across the rows, straight at me. "That's her," she said. "That's Miss Elena." And 100 faces turned. What happened next was not planned by anyone, and that is exactly why no one could stop it. Diego's mother, a small woman in a raincoat who cleaned offices at night and had never once missed picking him up, stepped forward from the wall with her hand on her son's shoulder and said in careful, accented English, "My son could not read 3 years ago. His school gave up. This woman, Miss Elena, she did not give up." She pointed at me. "Every day, in the rain, in the cold room. Every day, Miss Elena." She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. A mother saying "every day" into a silent hall is louder than any microphone. I saw the councilman turn and look at me for the first time. Really look. And I saw him glance down at Marcus's glossy 12-page proposal in his lap, and I watched a small line appear between his eyebrows. One by one, the children came up. Nobody organized it. Nobody had to. Diego read his, 2 whole pages, about learning to climb the wall of words. The twins read theirs together, arguing once, quietly, about a comma. A tiny girl named Priya read 4 sentences and forgot the last one and just said, and thank you, Miss Elena, and ran back to her mother. Each letter said my name. Each letter described the long green room, the flashcards I bought, the patience, the door with the light coming through. Not one letter, not one single letter out of 19 mentioned a Marcus, because the children had never once seen Marcus teach them anything. Because you cannot write a thank you note to a man who was never in the room. The paperwork said Marcus. The children said Elena. And the room, at last, was choosing. I did not stand up and shout. I did not wave my folder. I never even opened it. Everything I had been prepared to argue, every attendance sheet and lesson plan and the plain blue notebook, all of it stayed in my bag. Unnecessary. Because 19 children had already said it better than any document could. I just sat in the third row with tears running down my face while a line of my students spoke my name into a microphone in front of the whole neighborhood. Marcus stood off to the side of the podium, and I watched the confidence drain out of his face in real time. The way color drains from something left in the sun. There was nowhere for him to look. Every letter was another door closing. He had built his story out of paper, and children had walked in with pencils and blown it flat. The councilman was the one who finally spoke. He was an older man, and he had, I think, seen a few things in his years of public meetings. He turned to Marcus and asked, quite pleasantly, "Mr. Bell, the children seem to know a Miss Elena very well. I don't believe I've heard that name tonight. Is she on your staff?" And there it was, the simplest question in the world. And Marcus could not answer it without either lying to a room full of the woman's own students or telling the truth in front of the press and the board and our mother. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "Elena is my sister. She helps out." He helps out. From the wall, clear as a bell, Diego said, "She's the teacher. She's there every day. He only comes sometimes." Out of the mouths of children. The councilman nodded slowly and made a small note on his program. And I knew, watching that pen move, that the city was not going to be funding a director named Marcus Bell. I need to describe Marcus's face in that minute because I had never seen it before, and I have never forgotten it. My brother has a smile he has used his whole life, the easy salesman's. Smile that has gotten him out of 100 rooms. I watched him reach for it, out of habit, and I watched it fail. His mouth moved, but the smile would not come, because there is no charming way to stand in front of 19 children who have just, one by one, in their own handwriting, said that you were never there. He looked down at the framed certificate in his hands, the one that said, Founder. And I saw him understand that it was a piece of paper, and that paper had just lost, in public, to 19 pencils. He set the certificate down on the edge of the podium very carefully. The way you set down something that has become suddenly embarrassing to be holding. And he stepped back into the shadow at the side of the stage where the poster board of my photographs stood. Mrs. Okafor asked me to come to the podium. I did not want to. My legs felt like they belonged to someone braver. But Diego was watching, and Aaliyah was watching, and I have never once in 3 years let those children down. So I stood, and I walked up the aisle past my brother, past my mother, and I turned to face the hall. I did not accuse anyone. I want you to know I never said the word thief, never raised my voice, never so much as looked at Marcus with anything sharp. I simply said, "Thank you. These letters are the proudest thing I have ever earned." I started Open Door 3 years ago in a room with a broken radiator. And everything you heard tonight, every child who can read now, that was the work. Not mine alone, theirs. They did the hard part. I just refused to leave. And the hall stood up. All of it. For me. I have thought a great deal since that night about why I didn't ruin him. It would have been easy. I had the notebook, the original grant application in my own drafts folder, dated before his, the emails. 3 years of a paper trail I'd been too heartbroken to weaponize. The councilman would have listened. The press was right there. I could have turned my brother's public triumph into a public humiliation, and no one would have blamed me. But I looked at Marcus's face while Diego was speaking, and I did not see a villain. I saw a man who had spent his whole life being told he was the star, and who had reached the age of 38 with nothing to show for it, and who had looked at his quiet sister's beautiful work and thought, that could be mine, because taking had always been easier for him than building. I did not want to destroy him. I only wanted, finally, to be seen. And I had been. The children had made sure of it. The justice, when it came, was quiet, and it came from Marcus's own words rather than from any blow I struck. The city did not fund his director position. The foundation, once Mrs. P. Okafor quietly corrected the record, moved the grant contact to my name, where it should have been all along. The board asked me to become the paid coordinator of Open Door, an actual salary for the work I had done for free. And I said yes. And I hired one of my former volunteer high schoolers as an assistant. Marcus was not fired because there was nothing official to fire him from. The fact that turned out to be its own kind of poetry. That his invented title dissolved as easily as it had been invented. He simply stopped coming to the center. There was no scene. There was only the slow, dignified evaporation of a story that had never been true. A local reporter had been in the room that night, and a short piece ran in the neighborhood paper that week. It was only 4 paragraphs, tucked below a story about a road repair, but it named me. Open Door Tutoring Program, founded and run by teacher Alina Bell, it said. And I read that sentence in my kitchen at 6 a.m, and I read it again. And then I cut it out with scissors, and I taped it to my refrigerator, where it still is, going soft and yellow at the edges. For most of my life, I had believed that being named in public was a thing that happened to other people, to the Marcuses of the world. Seeing my own name printed as the founder of the thing I had actually founded felt less like triumph and more like being handed back something that had been quietly stolen from my coat pocket years ago. So long ago, I had stopped checking whether it was still there. The family part was harder, and I will not pretend it wrapped up neatly, because real families rarely do. My mother did not apologize. Not really. She said on the phone a week later, I just don't understand why the children had to embarrass Marcus like that in public. Even then, even after 19 letters, I took a breath and I said something I had waited 35 years to say, and I said it without anger, which is the only way it could have landed. I said, Mom, the children didn't embarrass anyone. They just told the truth. Marcus embarrassed himself the day he decided my work was worth stealing, but I wasn't worth mentioning. I'm not angry at him, but I'm done being the one who clears the plates so everyone else can shine. There was a long silence on the line. And then, very quietly, my mother said, You really built that program? All of it? And I said, Yes, Mom, all of it. And she said, I didn't know. And I believe that she truly, honestly did not know. Because she had never once thought to look at me long enough to find out. Marcus called me, finally, a month after that. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, he didn't apologize either. Not in words, but he said in a smaller voice than I had ever heard from my confident older brother. "Those kids really love you, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, they do." And he said, "I never had that. People clapping for me, sure. But nobody ever wrote me a letter." And I understood, in that moment, something that took the last of the poison out of my heart. My brother had spent his whole life collecting applause, and I had spent mine, without knowing it, earning love. And one of those things lasts, and one of them does not. I told him, "You could earn it. It's not too late. But you have to actually be in the room, Marcus. Every day. Even when it's boring. Even when nobody's watching. That's the whole secret. There isn't any other one." There is one more small scene I keep, from the week after the anniversary night, because it is the one that finally healed the oldest part of the wound. Diego stayed late one afternoon to help me stack chairs, and while we worked, he asked me, in his direct 9-year-old way, "Miss Elena, why didn't you tell everybody it was yours?" Before the party, I mean. I stopped stacking chairs. I thought about how to answer honestly without handing a child my whole complicated grief. Finally, I said, "Because I was scared no one would believe me." And Diego frowned, genuinely puzzled, and said, "But we would have believed you. You just had to ask us." And I had to turn away and pretend to fix the space heater so he wouldn't see my face. Because he was right, and it was that simple, and it had taken me 3 years and a public heartbreak to learn what a 9-year-old knew by instinct. Sometimes the people who can save you are the ones you're too busy protecting to ask. I still teach in that long room. The radiator still leaks, and I still fix it with folded cardboard. And there are 31 children on the rolls now, and a real waiting list, and a small budget for actual flashcards. The 19 letters are framed on the green wall, all of them, in a long, crooked row under my hand-painted sign of the door, with the light coming through. New students read them sometimes when they're waiting for their turn, and they ask me, "Miss Elena, is this you?" And I say, "Yes." I don't hide from my own name anymore. It took 19 children and one terrible, beautiful public night to teach me that lesson, that the quietest work is often the realest, and that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be given a room and a chance to speak. I want to leave you with the thing I understood, sitting in that third row while a 9-year-old boy raised his hand. For most of my life, I believed that if I just worked hard enough and kept my head down, someone in charge would eventually notice and hand me what I had earned. I was wrong. That is not how it works. Not in families and not in the world. No one hands the quiet person the microphone. But here is what I learned, and I offer it to you, wherever you are listening from tonight. You do not have to become loud to be seen. You have to become undeniable. Do the real work in the real room for the real people. And one day, the truth of it will walk in on its own 2 small feet, carrying a letter with your name on it, and no confident man in a good blazer will be able to say a single word. Keep your door open and keep your name.